Dr. Daniel Hayes had always thought that the worst part of being stranded on an alien planet would be the inevitable death from exposure, dehydration, or being eaten by something with too many teeth, and not enough respect for the academic tenure system. Turns out, the worst part was actually trying to explain to a group of heavily armed mercenaries why a xenobiologist might be useful enough to keep alive. "So let me understand this correctly," said the woman who appeared to be in charge, her voice carrying the sort of flat authority usually reserved for people who solved problems by shooting them. "You study alien life forms for a living." "That's a gross oversimplification, but essentially accurate," Daniel replied, trying to project competence while standing in the smoking wreckage of his research vessel. "I specialize in xenobiological adaptation patterns and cross-species ecological integration. And this helps us how?" Daniel looked around at the desert landscape of Kithara, where crystalline formations jutted from red sand like the ribs of some enormous buried creature. "Well, I can tell you which plants are edible, which animals are venomous, and how to predict weather patterns based on indigenous life cycle adaptations." The woman studied him with pale eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of his appearance and find most of it wanting. She was tall, even by human standards, with the elongated ears and slight skin pigmentation shifts that marked her as native Kitharan. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back in a practical knot, and her armor bore the sort of wear patterns that suggested it had stopped being decorative a long time ago. "Vera Thane," she said finally, "you can travel with us until we reach Crossroads Station. After that, you find your own way." "That's very generous," Daniel said, meaning it. "What do I call you?" "Commander, if we're being formal. Vera, if we're not." She turned to address the rest of her group, a mixed collection of humans and Kitharans who were busy salvaging anything useful from his crashed ship. "Hayes comes with us. He pulls his weight, or he finds his own transportation home." One of the other mercenaries, a burly human with facial scars that suggested an interesting relationship with explosives, looked up from the wreckage. "Commander, no offense, but what's a science guy going to contribute to a combat unit?" "Medical training," Daniel interjected quickly. "Field surgery, trauma care, poison treatment. I've patched up more researchers who have had unfortunate encounters with hostile wildlife than I care to count." Vera nodded once, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both acceptance and warning. "Medical support it is. Don't slow us down." The mercenary company moved across the desert with the sort of efficient coordination that came from years of practice, and the knowledge that mistakes in this environment were usually fatal. Daniel found himself assigned to the middle of their formation, close enough to be protected but far enough from the front to avoid being the first casualty if they encountered trouble. "First time on Kithara?" asked one of the younger mercenaries, a Kitharan woman whose ears twitched constantly as she monitored their surroundings. "First time anywhere this hostile," Daniel admitted. "My usual research involves significantly more laboratory time and significantly fewer people shooting at me." "Gets easier," she said with the sort of casual optimism that suggested she'd been shot at enough times to develop a professional attitude about it. "Just stay close to the commander. She's got a knack for keeping people alive." Daniel watched Vera move ahead of them, her movements precise and economical as she navigated the shifting sand. "She seems intense." "That's one word for it." The young mercenary's ears flicked in what Daniel was learning to recognize as amusement. "Fair warning, though, don't expect much in the way of conversation. Commander's not big on small talk." This proved to be an understatement of remarkable proportions. Over their first 3 days of travel, Daniel attempted various conversational approaches with Vera, ranging from professional inquiries about local wildlife to casual observations about the weather. Her responses were uniformly monosyllabic and delivered in a tone that suggested she considered words to be a limited resource that shouldn't be wasted on non-essential communication. "The rock formations ahead," Daniel said during one of his more optimistic attempts at dialogue. "They're actually fossilized coral structures. Suggests this entire region was underwater within the last geological epoch." "That's interesting," Vera replied, which Daniel was beginning to understand was her standard response to information she found neither interesting nor relevant to their immediate survival. "It means there might be underground water sources following the original reef patterns. Could be useful for navigation." This earned him an actual glance, though her expression suggested she was evaluating his potential usefulness rather than engaging in scientific discourse. "Show me on the map tonight." Their first real test came 4 days into the journey, when they encountered a supply convoy under attack by raiders. The convoy's guards were clearly outgunned and outnumbered, and Daniel watched in fascination as Vera's team transformed from a casual travel group into a coordinated combat unit in the space of seconds. "Hayes, stay back and be ready for casualties," Vera ordered, her voice carrying new authority. "Everyone else, standard flanking pattern. Let's make this quick." What followed was a demonstration of tactical precision that would have been impressive if it hadn't been quite so violent. Vera moved through the combat zone like liquid death, her weapon firing with mechanical accuracy while she called out positions and targets to her team. Within 15 minutes, the raiders were either dead or fleeing, and the convoy guards were staring at their rescuers with the sort of gratitude usually reserved for divine intervention. "Anyone need medical attention?" Daniel called out, already moving toward a wounded convoy guard. "Just minor injuries," Vera reported, checking on her own team. "Hayes, patch up what you can. We move in 20 minutes. As Daniel worked on treating a plasma burn on the guard's arm, he noticed Vera moving among the wounded with quiet efficiency, checking injuries and distributing medical supplies from her personal kit. Her bedside manner was non-existent, but her knowledge of field medicine was clearly extensive. "Your medic's got good hands," the injured guard told Daniel quietly. "She's not actually our medic," Daniel replied, applying a healing patch to the burn. "She's our commander." "Huh, most commanders I know wouldn't bother with the small stuff like this." Daniel glanced over at Vera, who was carefully checking a head injury on one of the younger convoy guards. "Yeah, she's full of surprises." That evening, as they made camp in the shelter of a rock formation, Daniel found himself reassessing his initial impressions of their leader. Her emotional detachment was obvious, but there were subtle inconsistencies in her behavior that suggested something more complex beneath the surface. "Commander," he said, settling down near the small fire they'd built, "that was good work today." Vera looked up from cleaning her weapon, her pale eyes reflecting the firelight. "It was a standard escort scenario, nothing complicated. Still, you saved lives. That counts for something." She was quiet for a long moment, her attention focused on her weapon maintenance. "Lives saved today might be lost tomorrow. The only thing that counts is completing the mission." Daniel watched her work, noting the careful precision of her movements and the way she seemed to withdraw into herself when the conversation turned toward anything that might be considered personal. "Is that how you see everything? In terms of mission completion?" "It's how you survive out here," Vera replied, not looking up. "Everything else is a luxury you can't afford." "What about the people you're protecting? Don't they matter beyond their tactical value?" This time she did look at him, her expression unreadable in the firelight. "Dr. Hayes, you're a scientist. You understand cause and effect, action and consequence. Out here, caring about people beyond their immediate utility is a good way to get everyone killed. And caring about them as people is a weakness that hostile forces will exploit," she finished flatly. "Get some sleep. We have a long day tomorrow." As Daniel settled into his bedroll, he found himself wondering what kind of world produced someone who could show such clinical concern for wounded strangers, while simultaneously maintaining that emotional investment was a tactical liability. Whatever had shaped Vera Thane's worldview, It had created someone who was either remarkably disciplined or remarkably damaged. Given the way her hands had lingered just slightly longer than necessary when checking his equipment earlier, Daniel was beginning to suspect it might be both. 2 weeks of traveling with Vera's mercenary company had taught Daniel several important lessons about survival on Cathara, the most significant being that the planet seemed actively committed to making every day slightly more dangerous than the last. Today's lesson involved learning that Kitharan culture had some deeply unsettling ideas about what constituted appropriate social interaction. "So let me make sure I understand this," Daniel said to Kira, the young Kitharan mercenary who had appointed herself as his unofficial cultural guide. "Showing concern for someone's well-being is considered manipulative." "Not manipulative exactly," Kira replied, her ears twitching as she scanned the horizon for potential threats. "More like strategically suspect. If you care about someone's survival beyond their utility to your mission, it suggests you might compromise tactical decisions for emotional reasons." Daniel watched Vera ahead of them, noting how she maintained exactly the same distance from each member of her team, never getting close enough to anyone to suggest personal attachment. "That seems like a lonely way to live." "Lonely's not really a concept we have," Kira said with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing the weather. "You have allies, enemies, and resources. Everything else is just inefficient thinking." "But you're talking to me right now. That's not exactly mission-critical." Kira's ears flicked in what Daniel had learned was amusement. "You're an off-worlder. Different rules apply. Besides, someone needs to keep you from accidentally violating social protocols and getting yourself killed." "How exactly would I get myself killed through social protocols?" "Well, if you tried to comfort someone who was grieving, they might interpret that as an attempt to make them emotionally dependent on you for future exploitation. Physical contact without explicit permission can be seen as a dominance display. And never, ever tell someone they did a good job unless you're in a position of authority over them." Daniel felt his understanding of basic human interaction crumble slightly. "What about compliments, expressions of gratitude?" "Compliments suggest the person needs your approval, which implies they're in a subordinate position. Gratitude creates social debt, which makes future interactions transactional rather than professional." "So how do people form connections?" Kira looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "Connections. Friendships, relationships, bonds with other people." "Oh, you mean tactical alliances." She considered this seriously. "Those form naturally through repeated successful cooperation and demonstrated reliability. No emotional expression required." Daniel glanced ahead at Vera again, beginning to understand why their commander seemed to operate in a bubble of professional isolation. Has anyone ever told Vera she did good work, ever? Why would they? Good work is expected. You don't praise people for meeting basic competency standards. And if someone went above and beyond those standards, then you might acknowledge their increased utility to future operations, Kira said, as if this were obvious. Though the commander doesn't really have above and beyond. She just has mission complete or mission failed. Their conversation was interrupted by Vera's raised hand, the signal for the group to halt and take cover. Daniel crouched behind a crystalline outcropping, watching as their commander studied something in the distance through her scope. "Hostile camp, approximately 2 kilometers northeast," she reported quietly. "Looks like they're holding prisoners from the merchant caravan that went missing last week." "Rescue mission?" asked Tors, the explosives expert. "If the pay's right," Vera replied. "Kira, see if you can raise the merchant guild on comms. Find out what they're willing to offer for prisoner recovery." While Kira worked on establishing communications, Daniel found himself studying the tactical situation through his binoculars. The enemy camp was well positioned, with good sight lines and natural barriers that would make a direct assault costly. "Commander," he said quietly, "I might have an idea." Vera looked at him with the sort of patient expression usually reserved for small children, who had announced their intention to help with complex adult tasks. "Dr. Hayes, this is a combat situation. I know, but I've been studying the local ecosystem, and there's something about this area that might be relevant." Daniel pointed toward a cluster of crystalline formations between their position and the enemy camp. "Those aren't just rocks. They're actually a form of colonial organism, kind of like coral but adapted for desert conditions. And this helps us how? They're extremely sensitive to certain sonic frequencies. If you hit them with the right vibration pattern, they release stored energy in the form of bioluminescent flashes. It's a defense mechanism against predators." Vera's expression shifted from patient tolerance to genuine interest. "How bright?" "Bright enough to cause temporary blindness at close range. Plus, the frequency disruption plays hell with electronic systems." Daniel felt a small surge of pride at being able to contribute something tactically useful. "If we could get close enough to activate them." "Natural flashbang grenades," Torres said appreciatively. "Doc, that's actually not terrible." "It's better than not terrible," Vera said, her tone carrying a note that might have been approval. "Show me the optimal approach routes." The next hour was spent in detailed mission planning, with Daniel contributing biological intelligence, while Vera and her team worked out the tactical implications. It was the first time since joining the group that Daniel felt like a valued team member rather than cargo with medical training. The mission itself went flawlessly. Daniel's biological knowledge proved accurate. The crystal organisms provided exactly the sort of distraction needed, and Vera's team extracted all 6 prisoners without casualties. It was a textbook operation that would have made any military instructor proud. "Nice work, everyone," Daniel said as they made their way back to their base camp with the rescued merchants. "That was—" He stopped mid-sentence, noting the way every member of the team was looking at him with expressions ranging from confusion to alarm. "Problem?" he asked. "You just complimented us," Kira whispered urgently. "All of us. At the same time. Is that bad? It suggests you think you're in a position of authority over the entire team," Torres explained helpfully, "including the commander." Daniel looked at Vera, who was studying him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I was just expressing appreciation for good work." "Appreciation implies emotional investment in outcomes beyond immediate utility," Vera said quietly. "It suggests you care about our performance for reasons that go beyond mission success." "Well, yes." Daniel felt like he was walking through a minefield made of social conventions. "Is that wrong?" Something flickered across Vera's face, too quick for Daniel to interpret. "It's unusual." That evening, as they made camp with their rescued merchants, Daniel noticed Vera making her usual rounds to check on equipment and personnel. But this time, when she stopped by his position to verify his medical supplies, she lingered just slightly longer than usual. "Your biological intelligence was useful today," she said quietly. "Thank you. I'm glad I could contribute something meaningful." "The sonic frequency data. Where did you learn to correlate biological responses with tactical applications?" Daniel looked up from organizing his medical kit, surprised by what almost sounded like genuine curiosity. "Mostly field experience. You spend enough time studying how organisms interact with their environment, you start to see potential applications beyond pure research." "Interesting." Vera was quiet for a moment, her pale eyes reflecting the firelight. "Your approach to problem-solving is unconventional. Is that good or bad?" "It's useful," she replied, which Daniel was beginning to understand might be the highest form of praise available in Kitharan culture. "Commander," he said carefully, "can I ask you something?" "You may ask." "Earlier when I said everyone did good work, you seemed surprised. Not just by the cultural violation but by the sentiment itself." Vera's expression grew more guarded. Emotional feedback regarding performance is uncommon in professional settings. But not just uncommon. You looked like I'd said something completely foreign. She was quiet for a long time, her attention focused on adjusting her weapon settings with unnecessary precision. Dr. Hayes, in Kitharan military culture, competence is expected and incompetence is eliminated. There is no middle ground requiring encouragement. And outside of military culture. There is no outside of military culture, Vera replied flatly. Not for people like me. Daniel wanted to ask what she meant by people like me. But something in her tone suggested the conversation was over. As she moved on to check the next position, he found himself wondering about the kind of childhood that taught someone to view kindness as a tactical liability and appreciation as a sign of weakness. Whatever had shaped Vera Thane into the person she was today, Daniel was beginning to suspect it had left some pretty significant scars along the way. The contract that would change everything arrived on what had started as a perfectly ordinary morning on Kithara, which Daniel was learning, meant that everyone was armed, alert, and expecting trouble. What distinguished this particular morning was the size of the payment being offered for what should have been a routine escort mission. 50,000 credits to babysit a diplomatic envoy through the scarred territories. Torres whistled appreciatively while cleaning his favorite explosive charges. Either this diplomat is extremely important or extremely likely to die horribly. Probably both, Vera replied, studying the mission parameters on her datapad. The client is offering hazard pay, completion bonuses, and full medical coverage. That suggests they expect significant casualties. Daniel looked up from his morning ritual of cataloging their medical supplies, a habit that had probably saved more lives than he wanted to think about. The scarred territories, that's the region where the ancient orbital bombardment turned most of the landscape into glass, right? Correct. Energy storms, unstable terrain, and limited navigation options. Vera's tone suggested she was already mentally calculating optimal routes and fallback positions. It's also a favorite hiding spot for raiders who don't mind the environmental hazards. Sounds delightful, Daniel muttered. Any particular reason we can't just refuse this suicidal contract? Because we need the money, Kira said pragmatically. And because the commander has never turned down a job due to danger level. Daniel glanced at Vera, who was still absorbed in mission planning with the sort of focused intensity she usually reserved for combat situations. Ever? Not once in the 4 years I've been with this unit, Torres confirmed cheerfully. It's either inspirational or deeply concerning, depending on your perspective. The journey to the rendezvous point took 2 days through terrain that gradually shifted from the familiar red desert to something that looked like a crystal manufacturer's fever dream. Massive glass formations jutted from the landscape at impossible angles, their surfaces reflecting and refracting sunlight in ways that made navigation by visual landmarks essentially useless. The energy storms in this region follow predictable patterns, Daniel observed, consulting his environmental readings. Every 6 hours, roughly, with peak intensity lasting about 20 minutes. If we time our movement correctly, we can use the storms as cover while avoiding the worst of the electromagnetic interference. Vera nodded, the first time Daniel could remember her accepting tactical advice from him without questioning his expertise. Show me the correlation patterns on the map. Their diplomatic escort turned out to be a Nexari trade representative, whose species Daniel had only read about in xenobiology journals. Ambassador Corvin was tall, elegant, and possessed of the sort of serene confidence that suggested he'd never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved through careful negotiation and proper paperwork. I must say, he told Vera during their initial briefing, I'm impressed by your company's reputation for successful mission completion. The Trade Council specifically requested your services. We complete contracts, Vera replied with her usual emotional flatness. Nothing more, nothing less. Quite refreshing, actually. So many mercenary groups try to convince their clients that they care about the outcome beyond the payment. Daniel caught something flicker across Vera's expression, too quick to interpret but somehow significant. And you prefer that approach? Oh, absolutely. Emotional investment creates complications. Much cleaner to work with professionals who understand that business is business. The ambush came on their second day in the scarred territories, just as they were approaching the halfway point of their planned route. Daniel's first indication that something was wrong was the way Vera suddenly went completely still. Her head tilted in a way that reminded him she was listening to things his human ears couldn't detect. Contact, multiple hostiles, converging on our position from 3 directions, she announced quietly. This is a planned killing field. How many? Torres asked, already reaching for his heavier weapons. Too many. Vera's voice carried a note Daniel had never heard before, something that might have been uncertainty. We're completely surrounded, and they've positioned themselves to cut off all primary escape routes. The attack came in waves, coordinated with the sort of precision that suggested their ambushers had been planning this operation for weeks. Energy weapons fired from concealed positions among the glass formations, creating a deadly crossfire that forced the mercenaries to take cover behind crystalline structures that provided questionable protection at best. They knew our route, Kira called out during a brief lull in the firing. This whole thing's a setup. Confirmed, Vera replied, her tactical calm beginning to show cracks as the situation deteriorated. Ambassador, did you tell anyone about our specific travel plans? Corvin, who was cowering behind a glass boulder with the sort of dignified terror usually reserved for diplomats in combat zones, shook his head frantically. Only the Trade Council, and they assured me of complete confidentiality. Well, someone talked, Torres said grimly, reloading his weapon, and now we're all going to pay for it. The battle devolved into a desperate fighting retreat, as their attackers systematically eliminated their positions and forced them deeper into the maze of glass formations. Daniel watched in growing horror as members of their team were picked off one by one, first Martinez, the team's scout, then Voss, their heavy weapons specialist, then others whose names he was only just beginning to learn. We need to separate, Vera announced during another brief respite, her voice carrying the sort of forced calm that suggested she was barely holding herself together. Smaller groups, different escape routes. It's the only way anyone survives this. Commander, Kira started to protest. That's an order, Vera cut her off, and Daniel could see the cost of that decision in the way her hands trembled slightly as she checked her weapon. Hayes, you're with me. Everyone else, scatter and make for the secondary rendezvous point. What followed were the longest 6 hours of Daniel's life, spent crawling through a landscape of razor-sharp glass, while energy weapons fired overhead, and Vera guided them through a series of increasingly desperate evasive maneuvers. Her knowledge of the terrain was remarkable, her tactical instincts flawless, but Daniel could see the emotional toll mounting with each distant explosion that might have been another team member dying. The old research station, she said finally, pointing toward a structure that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of black glass. It's abandoned, but the walls should block their sensors long enough for us to regroup. They made it to the station just as another energy storm began building on the horizon, the electromagnetic interference providing cover for the final sprint across open ground. Once inside, Vera immediately began checking perimeters and setting up defensive positions with mechanical efficiency, but Daniel noticed the way her hands shook when she thought he wasn't looking. Commander, he said gently, you need to sit down for a minute. I need to maintain security protocols, she replied, but her voice carried a hollowness that suggested she was running on autopilot. The station's secure. I've checked all the access points. Daniel guided her to a position where she could see both entrances while still having cover from external observation. We're safe here, at least for now. That's when the emotional walls that had held Vera together through the entire nightmare finally began to crack. She sat staring out at the glass desert where her team, her friends, Daniel realized with sudden clarity, had died, and for the first time since he'd known her, she looked not like an invincible warrior but like someone who had just lost everything that mattered. "I should have seen it coming," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. "Should have recognized the setup, should have planned for betrayal, should have." "Should have what?" Read minds, predicted the future. Daniel settled down beside her, noting the way she flinched slightly at his proximity. "Vera, there was no way you could have known. It was my responsibility to keep them safe." The first tear slipped down her cheek, followed by another, as years of suppressed emotion finally found their way to the surface. "My team, my people, and I failed them." Daniel watched this woman who had seemed invulnerable finally allow herself to be human, and felt something break open in his own chest. Without thinking about cultural protocols or professional boundaries, he reached out and gently touched her shoulder. "You're brave and sweet," he said softly, the words emerging from someplace deeper than conscious thought. The effect was immediate and devastating. Vera froze completely, her pale eyes widening as if he'd spoken in a language she didn't recognize. Then the dam burst entirely, and she began to cry like a child who had been holding back tears for far too long. The sound of Vera crying was unlike anything Daniel had ever heard, raw, broken, and somehow ancient, as if years of carefully contained emotion were finally finding their way to the surface. She wept like someone who had forgotten how, her body shaking with sobs that seemed to surprise her as much as they devastated her. "I don't understand," she gasped between tears, looking at Daniel with the sort of confusion usually reserved for people trying to solve impossible equations. "Why would you say that? Why would you call me sweet?" Daniel felt his heart break a little more with each word. "Because it's true. Because even when you're trying to be all business and tactical efficiency, you take extra rations to wounded strangers. Because you position yourself between danger and the people you're protecting, even when it's not strategically optimal. Because you care about your team more than you'll ever admit." "Caring is weakness," Vera whispered, but the words sounded hollow now, like something she'd been taught rather than something she believed. "No," Daniel said firmly, settling beside her against the glass wall of the abandoned station. "Caring is what makes you fight harder when everything goes wrong. It's what made you get all of us out of that killing field when anyone else would have cut their losses and run." "I got them killed." The words came out broken, punctuated by sobs that seemed to tear something loose inside her chest. "Martinez, Voss, all of them. They trusted me to keep them safe and I failed." "You kept me safe. You kept yourself safe. You made impossible decisions under impossible circumstances, and you saved who you could." Daniel reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away and gently wiped tears from her cheek. "That's not failure, Vera. That's heroism." "Heroes don't exist," she said automatically, but her voice lacked conviction. "There are only survivors and casualties." "Then explain to me why you gave Kira your emergency rations 3 days ago when you thought no one was looking. Explain why you always take point position during dangerous reconnaissance. Explain why you stayed behind to make sure Ambassador Corvin reached cover before securing your own position." Vera stared at him through tear-blurred eyes. "How did you?" "Because I've been watching you for weeks, trying to figure out how someone could be so competent at caring for people while insisting that caring makes you weak." Daniel's voice grew gentler. "You've been taking care of everyone around you while convincing yourself it was just tactical efficiency. My instructors said emotional attachment compromises judgment," Vera whispered, but something in her tone suggested she was questioning those lessons for the first time. "Your instructors were wrong." Daniel settled more comfortably beside her, close enough to offer comfort but not so close as to make her feel trapped. "Caring doesn't make you weak. It makes you fight smarter, plan better, and push harder when the people you love are counting on you." The word love hung in the air between them like a challenge to everything Vera had been taught to believe. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, but these seemed different somehow, less desperate, more wondering. No one has ever. She started, then stopped, shaking her head. In my entire life, no one has ever called me sweet. Kind, maybe, if they were trying to insult me. Efficient when they were being complimentary. But sweet. What about your family? Friends when you were younger? Vera's laugh was bitter and broken. Kitharan military families don't do sweet, Daniel. We do useful, competent, tactically sound, and strategically valuable. Children who show emotional responses are considered problematic. Daniel felt something cold settle in his stomach. Problematic how? Remedial training, emotional conditioning, extended periods of isolation until you learn to manage your responses appropriately. Vera's voice grew distant, as if she were recounting someone else's memories. I spent most of my childhood in tactical academies where showing weakness, which included things like homesickness, fear, or affection for other trainees, resulted in punishment severe enough to discourage repetition. Jesus, Vera. Daniel reached for her hand, relieved when she didn't pull away. That's not training, that's abuse. It's effective, she replied automatically, then paused. At least I always thought it was effective. But watching you work with the team, seeing how your kindness actually makes people perform better. She trailed off, confusion replacing some of the grief in her expression. People fight harder for leaders they trust to care about them, Daniel said quietly. They take bigger risks, show more creativity, push themselves further. Your team didn't follow you just because you were competent. They followed you because somehow, despite all that conditioning, your humanity still showed through. Vera was quiet for a long time, processing this concept. The way you look at me, she said finally, like I'm not just a weapon with a convenient medical degree, is that how you see all of us? I see people, Daniel replied simply. Complicated, flawed, brave, sometimes scared people who are doing their best in difficult circumstances. And what I see when I look at you is someone who spent her whole life being told that the best parts of herself were weaknesses that needed to be eliminated. What if they were right? What if caring about people trying to be sweet? What if that gets more people killed? Daniel was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. Vera, in the 3 weeks I've known you, I've watched you make split-second decisions that saved lives, share resources with people who had nothing to offer you in return, and risk your own safety to protect others. If that's what weakness looks like, then maybe the problem isn't with you. Maybe it's with a system that taught you to be ashamed of your own compassion. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, but her breathing was starting to steady. I don't know how to be different. I don't know how to let people see. You don't have to change everything at once, Daniel said softly. Maybe just start by accepting that the person I see, brave, caring, stronger than she knows, is who you actually are, not some tactical failure that needs to be corrected. Vera leaned against him then, her head resting on his shoulder with the tentative trust of someone learning to believe that gentleness didn't always hide ulterior motives. Daniel. Yeah. Thank you for seeing me, for saying. She hesitated, for saying I was sweet. No one has ever. I didn't know I needed to hear that until you said it. Daniel felt the weight of her trust, the magnitude of what it meant for someone raised in such emotional isolation to allow herself this moment of vulnerability. You are sweet, Vera, and brave, and worth caring about, not because of what you can do for other people, but because of who you are. They sat together in comfortable silence as the energy storm raged outside, two people from different worlds learning that some things, kindness, connection, the courage to be vulnerable, were universal constants that transcended species and culture. When we get out of here, Vera said quietly, when we make it back to civilization. Yeah, I want to try being different, not all at once, but I want to try letting people see the person you seem to think I am. Daniel smiled, squeezing her hand gently. I think they're going to like what they see. And if they don't, then they're idiots, Daniel replied with enough conviction to make her laugh. A real laugh, bright and genuine, and completely at odds with the controlled emotional responses she'd maintained for weeks. You know, she said, settling more comfortably against his shoulder, I think I'm beginning to understand why caring about people might actually make you stronger, not weaker. Oh yeah, how's that? Because right now, caring about you, about getting you safely off this planet, about making sure you know how much your kindness means to me, that's giving me more reason to fight than any tactical objective ever has. Daniel felt warmth spread through his chest, a sense of connection deeper than anything he'd experienced in his academic career. Vera, I care about you too, and not just because you're tactically useful. Her armor might have been designed to hide emotional responses, but the way she smiled, soft, wondering, and completely genuine, was the most beautiful thing Daniel had ever seen. I love you too, Daniel, she whispered, the words carrying the weight of someone saying them for the first time in her life. And in that moment, surrounded by the alien landscape of a hostile world, two people who had thought they understood the boundaries of their own